Hey, what is going on guys, RvzStealth here, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at the buffed and nerfed champions heading into 9.17, talk about how the meta is going to change for this upcoming patch, and give a tier list prediction for each of the champions getting buffed and nerfed. And just a quick announcement before we get started guys, Club.gg or Quarterback have rebranded to Icon, so the exact same app, although it does have a couple new features now, and it is now called Icon. They are giving me a couple of RP cards to raffle off to you guys as well, and all you got to do to enter into the giveaway is join my Discord, enter the giveaway on my Discord, and play at least one challenge, be joined in my club, and play at least one challenge before the giveaway is over, and you will be eligible to win an RP card. So pretty simple. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the app, super easy to use. All you got to do is click play now, join one of these challenges before you start a game. If you win the challenge, you get coins. With these coins, you can go into the store here, or you can also go into the raffle page, buy a raffle ticket for a certain skin or for a bundle of skins. You can also go into the shop here and you can purchase RP with your coins. So super easy to use app guys, might as well be using it when you're playing League to get yourself some free RP. So link is going to be down in the description below. So to start things off here, take a look at Pantheon first. His tap Q is now going to crit targets below 25%, so a pretty nice buff there to his Q. His E is also no longer going to take reduced damage from monsters, so a buff there to jungle Pantheon more so for 9.17. I don't think this is going to address his main issue though. Right now Pantheon scales horrendously into the mid to late game. He's got even worse scaling than he had before, so this change doesn't really affect that at all, and I see him getting a little bit stronger with these changes, but I don't see him going up into like S tier or anything. He's going to remain a B or A tier pick. Alright, so next up here, taking a look at Galio, tier list prediction is going to be either staying B tier or jumping up into A tier. I think for lower elos, this buff is going to be more impactful. So Q cooldown is being lowered at the earlier ranks. W minimum and W maximum damage are both being increased, and by quite a substantial amount as well, especially the max damage there at max rank in your W. It's going up by 90, which is actually pretty insane. So if you do get a fully charged W off in a team fight, then you are definitely going to be noticing the damage increase there. With the amount of mobility that's in the game now, and the fact that you can no longer use your W flash combo that was taken out a couple patches ago, it just makes Galio's playmaking potential much weaker in the mid to late game. And even though this is a pretty big buff here to his damage on his W, if you're not actually able to hit your W, then it doesn't mean anything at all. And with a lot of champions just having dashes, a lot of the time you're not even gonna be able to hit your W on them in mid to late game fights. So I do think this change is more so of a buff to lower elos, where players aren't gonna have as much reaction time and you're gonna be able to hit your W more consistently. But I just don't really like the direction they're taking with Galio. They're just like adding a ton of damage into his kit. I just wish they would give him back his taunt flash combo, because I feel like by removing that, it just takes away a lot of his solo carry and playmaking potential in solo queue. So next up here for Zyra, Zyra is actually getting buffed for next patch, which is pretty interesting. I don't really think she needs a buff. Zyra is in a solid spot right now for solo queue, pretty good A tier pick. I guess this buff could be more so targeted towards the competitive scene. They want to see Zyra more in competitive, but for solo queue, I do predict that she is going to jump up into S tier for 9.17. So mana cost on her ultimate is being changed. It's just being changed to 100 at all ranks now, and the bigger change here is to the cooldown on her ultimate. So it's being reduced by 20 seconds at rank 1. Really nice buff there, because it does mean that your playmaking potential does go up in the early game with Zyra. Your carry potential does go up as well. Whenever your ultimate is up with this champion, you can pretty much look to 100 to 0 somebody, or you can just look to play so much more aggressive when you do have your ultimate up. So this is a great change to Zyra, and I do think she is going to make that jump to S tier for 9.17. So next up for Ryze, he is getting a base MR increase from 30 up to 34, so a pretty nice buff there if you are up against AP matchups. Now if we're talking about solo queue here and not competitive, I don't really think this affects his spot on the tier list. I think he's going to stay a B tier champion. Originally he was looking to get a pretty nice buff to his E as well for this patch, which if that went through, I do think he would have jumped up into A tier, but because that didn't go through, I still think he's going to be a B tier pick. In solo queue, you are going to see a lot of AD assassins being played in the mid lane, especially in the lower elos, so this buff isn't even going to come into effect a lot of your games in the laning phase. And I do think that for the higher elos, this is more of a buff. For the competitive scene, this is more of a buff, but for your average Ryze player, I don't think it makes him that much better for 9.17. So next up for Calista, she is getting a couple of different buffs here to her base stats. So in this patch 9.16, Calista is the worst performing AD carry in the majority of elos. Higher elos, she's not doing too bad right now. She's like a B or A tier pick, and I think that with these changes, depending on what elo you're in, she could jump up into A tier for the higher elos. I think for lower elos though, she is still going to remain a B tier pick. So base AD there being increased by 2, base mana being increased by 20, and the mana per level being increased by 10. So a couple of small buffs to her base stats there, not really going to change your placing too much on the tier list for 917. And then the second AD carry getting buffed is Lucien. So Lucien and Calista both getting their base ADs increased for 917, and this is now going to put Lucien at the second highest base AD for any AD carry in the game, right behind Calista. So I do think that possibly we could see a different build path for Lucien for this coming patch. Might see a Trinity Force rush now because base AD, really good synergy there with Trinity Force, and the fact that it's getting buffed for next patch is going to help that synergy out even more. I know back in the day, some Lucien players used to go Trinity Forest. I think it was actually a core build on him a couple of seasons ago, so that might pop up now in 9.17, but I think other than that, it's not going to be enough to jump him up into S tier. I still think he's going to remain an A tier AD carry. And then next up here, Leona is getting a buff to her Q, so cooldown is being lowered from 6 seconds down to 5 seconds. I think the bigger buff though, the indirect buff to Leona for next patch, would be the fact that Zyra is going to be played a lot more. Squishy support, Leona can look to all in at level 2 very easily, lock down and just burst out. So with Zyra being played more, I think that's more of a buff to Leona than this buff to her Q is. I think Leona in this patch right now is a pretty solid pick, pretty good A tier pick. So depending on which supports end up seeing more play next patch, and with this buff here, she could even make the jump up into S tier. Alright, so next up here for Kayle, she is getting a ton of different changes for next patch, and I'm not 100% sure if these are going through in 9.17 or if they're going to wait another patch, but I think they're going through, so we are going to be going over them in this video. Now for the tier list prediction, it's pretty difficult to predict where a champion's going to place if they're getting a ton of different changes, so I am going to predict either A or S tier for next patch, but I could be completely wrong, so don't really take my prediction with a grain of salt. It could be completely off for next patch. So passive changes here though, move speed is being changed from 15% towards champions to 8% in all directions. It can now stack against towers, and you are gonna now have your range form at level 6 instead of at level 11. So this does mean that Kayle's early game does become stronger now, or her early to mid game does become stronger for 9.17. The AoE attacks though are now gonna be moved to when you do hit level 11. So the range is going to be lowered though by a little bit, down from 550 to 525. Attack speed per stack while range is also going to be lowered from 10% down to 6%. And then they are going to be removing the true damage when you do hit level 16 with Kayle, but they're going to be adding 50 range. So technically that's only going to be 25 range compared to like where it is right now in this patch, because they're reducing the range from 550 down to 525 when you do hit level 6, but they're increasing it from 525 to 575 when you do hit level 16. So the Q changes here are really nice. So your Q is now going to reduce 50% mana cost if it hits a champion. So your mana usage in the laning phase becomes much better now for 9.17. Cast delay is going to be lowered from 0.5 down to 0.25. Also a really nice change. Cast time is going to be changed from auto attack timer down to 0.25. Now the missile speed though, it is going to be lowered from 2000 down to 1600. Range going to be lowered by a little bit. Shred is going to be lowered by 5%, but the shred duration is going to be increased from 3 to 4. So I think I would definitely take these little compensation nerfs for the fact that it's now going to refund 50% mana, and the cast delay is also now going to be lowered. And then for the E changes here, it looks like they're more so forcing Kayle towards an AP build for 9.17 because the AP ratio on her E damages are being increased. So 1% per 100 AP on her execute damage up to 2% per 100 AP, but the scaling or the base scaling on it is being reduced, and the passive damage AP ratio going from 20% up to 25%, but the AD scaling on her passive, on her E, it is being changed from total AD to bonus AD, so that is going to be a little bit of a nerf there to her AD scaling and a buff to her AP scaling. So we'll have to see how the build does change for Kayle for 9.17, but I think this is now going to favor more so of an AP build. And then lastly, ultimate changes, mana cost being lowered there at rank 2 and at rank 3, and then AoE radius being increased from 475 up to 500. Don't think these are going to be the changes that are the most impactful to Kayle for next patch. I think the changes to her passive, Q, and E are going to be the big ones there, and I do think these should end up being net buffs to Kayle for 9.17, but like I said earlier, we will have to wait and see. There's just a ton of different changes here, and it is going to be, or it is pretty hard to predict where she is going to place for this coming patch. And then for Neko, getting a small quality of life change to her passive to where you're now going to be able to cancel the disguise. This is definitely a nice change in certain situations. I know for the early game when you're playing Neko, a lot of the time you do want to disguise yourself as the jungler. So if your jungler is like melee or something and you have to walk to lane as a melee champion there and you have to waste an ability to get out of your disguise, it can be annoying sometimes. So this is going to be like a small buff to Neko. It's not going to bump her up though or anything. She is going to remain an A-tier pick. And then for Aurelion Sol, the final champion getting buffed for next patch, or at least I think he's going to end up getting buffed. Similar to Kayle, it's pretty difficult to predict where he's going to place on the tier list just because he's kind of getting a mini rework to his W for 9.17. So I think at the start of the patch, you're probably going to see a drop in win rate as people get used to playing him and get used to the new playstyle and how his new W works. But I do think that as the patch does progress and as people do end up understanding how to use his new W, I do think it should end up being a positive change for Aurelion Sol. So passive changes here, it is actually getting nerfed, so the base damage on passive is being reduced. The scaling on it is being increased, I guess, in the earlier ranks because it's being changed from 18 to 35% scaling just to 25% at all ranks. Now, considering you don't usually build a ton of AP in the earlier levels with Aurelion Sol, usually your first base or your first item is going to be a catalyst there. That's not going to provide you with any AP, so I do think overall this should be a net nerf to his passive. Now for Q changes, cooldown is being changed there. It's being reduced by quite a lot. So 10, it's now going to be 7 once you do get it maxed out. So really nice change there to Aurelion Sol's Q. Movement speed is being increased as well from 10% up to 20%. And then the big changes here are to his W. So his W is now going to cause Aurelion Sol's stars to expand, gaining increased damage and rotating at a high but decaying speed. Upon reactivating or after 3 seconds, the stars are going to retract, granting 40% movement speed, decaying over 1.5 seconds. So because you do now have that movement speed on your W, does this mean that Aurelion Sol no longer runs Phase Rush? That could be something interesting for 9.17. We might see more Aurelion Sol players just go for Electrocute, go for a very heavy damage build, a burstier build for 9.17, or a burstier setup, I should say. The cooldown on it is going to be scaling down to 2 seconds once you do get it maxed out. So that does mean that you're probably going to max this ability out first so that you can have that up a lot of the time. You're not just going to be able to have it out at all times now. It is going to only last 3 seconds, but it is going to be a lot more burst damage potential definitely for this coming patch. And the mana cost is being changed there from 40 plus 22 per second, but because it's not going to be per second anymore, it's just going to be 70 scaling up to 110 per use. So basically what these changes mean is that Aurelion Sol is now going to be more of a burstier champion. You're not going to have as much sustained DPS for next patch, but you're definitely going to have a lot more upfront burst and a lot more, I guess, one-shot potential with Aurelion Sol for 9.17. And then lastly, the E changes are really nice here as well. They are going to be removing the passive move speed, but the range on it is going to be increased there from 3,000 up to 5,500 at rank 1. So this is nice because this now does mean that you probably don't even need to put more than 1 point into this ability. I know most Aurelion Sol players would usually go 2 points into a Z, 1 point at level 3, and then usually 1 point at level 8, but because this range did get increased by a lot, you're probably no longer going to put a point into it at level 8, and because of that, you can now put a point into your W or your Q for some extra damage there. The speed on his E is also being changed for next patch. It's going to be increased at the later ranks. So I think overall, these are great changes to Aurelion Sol. I do think this is definitely going to increase not only his win rate possibly for next patch, but also his play rate. I think this new play style that Aurelion Sol is going to have, the fact that his W is going to deal more burst damage. If you hit a Q, follow that up with your W, it's going to be a lot more burst damage, straight up burst for next patch. So I think that kind of play style is going to attract more players to Aurelion Sol. So he is going to see more play. I also think that it's just going to be a more healthier play style, because previous patches, Aurelion Sol players would just look to pretty much just AFK shove in waves level 1 to level 6 even, and they wouldn't really try to interact at all in the laning phase. They just shove and look for roam play, but you're definitely going to have a lot more laning interaction now with this iteration of Sol in 9.17. And then lastly, to round out the video, guys, the only champion getting nerfed in this patch is Kiana, so that's quite a surprise, because usually Riot nerfs a lot more champions than they do buff champions, but I guess maybe they're changing their philosophy here as the patches do progress. So Kiana, I do think that the tier list prediction there is going to depend on the elo. High elo right now, she is probably an S tier pick, or she's arguably an S tier pick in 9.16, so higher elo, she is going to drop down into A tier. For lower elos right now, she's like an A/B tier pick, so I do think she is going to drop down into B tier for the lower elos. E damage is being lowered there by 20 at all ranks. Ultimate's cooldown is being changed from 120 scaling down to 80 just to 120 at all ranks now, so this is definitely going to decrease Kiana's playmaking potential there in the mid to late game. So that is going to be it for the video, guys. Hopefully you did enjoy, and hopefully this does give you a pretty good idea of how the meta is going to shake up here in 9.17. If you guys did enjoy this video, then be sure to drop a like, subscribe if you haven't already. So thanks for watching, have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.